Clara Mendez had learned to move through the world like a whisper. She arrived at Davenport and Associates every morning at 6 o'clock, before the executives with their leather briefcases and the assistants with their coffee orders. Her uniform was navy blue, the color of deep water, and she wore it like armor against a world that had taught her she was not worth seeing. The building stood 30 floors above the chaos of downtown, all glass and steel and the kind of silence that money bought. Clara pushed her cleaning cart through the corridors on the 23rd floor, her movements practiced and precise. She knew every corner of this place. She knew which desk belonged to the woman who cried in the bathroom on Tuesdays. She knew which conference room held meetings where voices rose and doors slammed. She knew the names of people who had never once said her name. She sprayed glass cleaner on the windows that overlooked the city and wiped until they gleamed. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no one in this building would notice. They were too busy checking emails, planning meetings, climbing ladders that Clara sometimes thought were made of nothing at all. At lunchtime, she sat on a plastic stool near the service elevator, her metal lunchbox open on her lap. Rice and beans, a piece of grilled chicken, a slice of tomato. It was the same meal she had eaten every day for 3 years, and she did not mind. Food was fuel. Food was not something she allowed herself to crave. But while she ate, her hands were never still. From her bag, she pulled out 2 wooden knitting needles and a ball of yarn the color of moss. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Click. 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 The needles sang their quiet song, and the scarf beneath them grew stitch by stitch, row by row. Clara had been knitting since she was 7 years old, when her mother had placed needles in her hands and said, "This is how we survive. We make things. We create warmth when the world gives us cold." Her mother was gone now. Had been gone for 8 years, taken by an illness that moved faster than any doctor could chase. Clara had been 19 when she buried her, and she had been alone ever since. The scarf she was making would join the others in her bag. She had 12 finished already, each one different, each one made with the same careful attention. She would sell them at the subway station after work, spreading them out on a cloth she kept folded in her cart. Some days she sold 3. Some days she sold none. But she kept knitting, because her mother had told her to never stop, because the needles in her hands were the only thing that made her feel like she was still alive. She did not know that someone was watching her. Arthur Davenport did not believe in staying behind closed doors. His office was on the 31st floor, a corner space with windows on 2 sides, but he rarely stayed there for long. He walked the building instead. He visited departments. He asked questions. He shook hands with security guards and nodded at mailroom clerks because he had not forgotten where he came from. He had started with nothing. A boy from a small town in the interior, raised by a grandmother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. He had arrived in the city at 18 with a suitcase full of hope and a heart full of desperation. He had slept on park benches. He had washed dishes in restaurant kitchens. He had built his company brick by brick, deal by deal, year by year. Now he was 62 years old, and he had everything money could buy. But he had learned long ago that money did not buy the things that mattered most. He was walking through the 23rd floor when he saw her. She was sitting on a plastic stool near the service elevator, her lunchbox open beside her, her hands moving with a speed and grace that made him stop. She was knitting. In a corporate tower where everyone was rushing somewhere, she sat perfectly still except for her hands, which moved like they were dancing. Arthur leaned against the wall and watched. He did not mean to stare. But there was something about the way she held the needles, something about the way her fingers wrapped around the yarn, that pulled him backward through time. He was 9 years old again, sitting on the floor of his grandmother's kitchen. She was in her rocking chair by the window, her needles clicking in the afternoon light, her voice humming a song he had long forgotten. She knitted for everyone. Sweaters for the neighbors. Blankets for the church. hats for the children at the shelter. She gave everything away, and when Arthur asked her why she never sold any of it, she had laughed and said, "Some things are not meant to be sold. Some things are meant to be given." She died when he was 15. He had been too young, too angry, too stupid to understand what he was losing. In the years that followed, he had thrown himself into work, into ambition, into the pursuit of a success that he thought would fill the space she had left behind. It never did. Now, watching this woman knit in a corner of his building, he felt something crack open inside him. A door he had locked long ago. A room he had filled with dust and silence. He did not approach her. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked back toward the elevator, his footsteps quiet on the polished floor. But he did not forget her. That evening, Clara packed her cart and clocked out at 5:30. She changed out of her uniform in the basement locker room, folded it carefully, and pulled on her street clothes. A gray cardigan that had seen better days. Black pants with a patch on the knee that she had sewn herself. Comfortable shoes that carried her through the city without complaint. Her knitting bag was heavier than usual. She had finished 2 scarves during her breaks, a deep burgundy and a soft cream, and they lay at the bottom of the bag like sleeping animals. She zipped it closed and walked toward the subway station 3 blocks away. The platform was crowded at this hour. People streamed past her, their faces buried in phones, their ears plugged with music, their eyes fixed on nothing. Clara found her usual spot near the wall, where the floor was a little cleaner and the light was a little better. She spread out her cloth, the same cloth her mother had used years ago, its edges frayed but its center still bright. She arranged her scarves in rows, organizing them by color, stepping back to admire her work. She had been doing this for 2 years. At first, she had been terrified. What if someone recognized her? What if someone from work saw her? But no one from work ever took the subway. They had cars and ride shares and company shuttles. They moved above ground, in the light, while Clara moved below, in the shadows. A woman stopped to look at the blue scarf. She picked it up, felt the fabric, asked the price. Clara told her $20, and the woman smiled and handed over a bill. She did not haggle. She did not ask where the scarf came from or who had made it. She simply took it and walked away, already wrapping it around her neck. Clara tucked the money into her pocket and felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest. It was not about the money, though the money mattered. It was about the knowing that something she had made with her own hands was now part of someone else's life. It would keep them warm. It would wrap around them on a cold day. It would be there, even after she was gone. She sold 2 more scarves before her train arrived. A gray one to a young man who said it was for his mother. A green one to an older woman who said it reminded her of the forest where she grew up. Clara smiled at both of them, and they smiled back, and for a moment she was not invisible. The train carried her home to the small apartment she rented in a neighborhood that most people avoided. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, unlocked 2 locks, and stepped into a space that was barely larger than her cleaning cart. But it was hers. The walls were painted yellow, the color of sunlight, because her mother had always said that yellow brought happiness. There was a single window that looked out onto a narrow street, and on the sill sat a photograph of a woman with Clara's eyes and Clara's smile. She made tea, sat on her worn couch, and pulled out her knitting. The needles clicked in the quiet room. The yarn wound itself around her fingers. And for a few hours, between the end of one day and the beginning of another, Clara Mendez was at peace. She did not know that across the city, in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than she would earn in a year, Arthur Davenport sat in the dark, holding a scarf she had made. He had bought it from her that very evening, though she had not recognized him. He had worn old clothes, a cap pulled low, and approached her table like a stranger. "How much?" he had asked. "$20, she had said, and her voice was soft, like water over stones. He had paid and walked away, and now he sat in his apartment with the blue scarf in his hands, running his fingers over the stitches, feeling the loops and knots and the spaces between them. He could see the care in every row. He could feel the hours she had spent, the patience she had given, the love she had poured into something that would warm a stranger's neck. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of the sweaters she had made, the blankets she had given away, the things he had not valued until they were gone. And he made a decision. The days that followed became a quiet ritual that Arthur Davenport did not fully understand but could not stop. Each morning, he walked through the 23rd floor, always passing by the service elevator area where Clara Mendez sat during her lunch break. He never spoke to her. He never made his presence known. He simply paused at the corner, out of sight, and watched her hands move. The needles clicked in their steady rhythm. The scarves grew beneath her fingers, each one a small miracle of patience and care. He learned her habits. She ate at the same time every day, her lunchbox opened with the same careful movements. She never spoke to anyone during her breaks. People passed by without acknowledging her, their eyes sliding over her like she was part of the furniture. And each day, when her break ended, she packed her knitting away with the same quiet dignity and returned to her cleaning cart, her head held high despite the weight of being unseen. Arthur had built an empire by noticing things that others ignored. He had learned to see the small details, the subtle signals, the cracks in the facade. And what he saw in Clara Mendez was not a cleaner. He saw a woman who had been broken by life but had refused to shatter. He saw a woman who created beauty in a world that offered her none. He saw a woman who deserved to be seen. On Thursday evening, he decided to follow her. It was not a decision he made lightly. He was not a man who invaded privacy or crossed boundaries. But something pulled him toward her, something stronger than curiosity, something that felt like recognition. He needed to understand. He needed to know the whole story. He left his office at 5 o'clock, earlier than usual, and waited in the lobby. When Clara emerged from the service elevator, her bag slung over her shoulder, he followed at a distance. She walked through the glass doors and into the street, her head down against the wind, her footsteps quick and sure. She turned onto a side street, then another, moving through the city with the ease of someone who knew every corner, every shortcut, every shadow. Arthur stayed behind, keeping to the opposite side of the street, his collar turned up against the evening chill. He had changed out of his suit into jeans and a jacket, hoping to blend in, but he knew he still looked out of place. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that marked him as different from the people who moved through these streets. Clara stopped at a small grocery store, the kind with produce displayed in wooden crates outside and a bell that rang when the door opened. She bought a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a bag of apples. She counted her change carefully, and Arthur saw her put a few coins back into her pocket before handing over the bills. Then she walked toward the subway station. The platform was busier than he remembered from his own days of riding trains, decades ago. People pushed past one another, their faces tense with the exhaustion of another day survived. Clara found her spot near the wall, and Arthur watched as she knelt down, spread her cloth, and began arranging her scarves. He stood at the other end of the platform, watching her work. She talked to customers with a gentle warmth that surprised him. She laughed with a woman who complimented her work. She showed a young girl how the yarn felt against her cheek. And each time someone bought a scarf, she tucked the money away with a small smile that lit up her face like morning light. Arthur bought a paper cup of coffee from a vendor and stood in the shadows, watching. He watched her for an hour. He watched the way her hands moved when she knitted between customers, the needles flashing in the fluorescent light. He watched the way she greeted each person who stopped at her table, no matter how they treated her. He watched her pack up when the crowd thinned, folding her cloth with the same care she gave to everything, and walk toward the train. He followed her onto the car, staying at the far end, his eyes fixed on the window glass. She sat near the doors, her bag on her lap, her head resting against the wall. She looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that seeped into bones and settled there, becoming a permanent weight. The train rattled through the tunnels, stopping at station after station. Clara did not move. She sat with her eyes half closed, her hands still wrapped around her knitting bag, and Arthur wondered what she was thinking. What dreams did she carry? What hopes had she buried? What had brought her to this life of cleaning floors and selling scarves, of moving through the world like a ghost? He thought of his grandmother again. She had worked 3 jobs after his grandfather died, cleaning houses and sewing clothes and taking in laundry. She had come home each night with swollen hands and tired eyes, but she had never once complained. She had sat in her rocking chair with her knitting needles, the same needles she had brought from the old country, and she had made things of beauty from the scraps of her exhaustion. She had taught him that dignity was not about money. It was about how you carried yourself when the world gave you nothing. It was about what you created when you had nothing to create with. It was about the quiet strength of continuing, day after day, when continuing was the hardest thing in the world. Clara Mendez reminded him of his grandmother. The train reached her stop, and she stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Arthur waited until the doors opened, then followed her up the stairs and onto the street. This neighborhood was different from the gleaming towers where his company stood. The buildings here were older, their facades worn, their windows covered with bars and grates. But there was life here too. Children played on the sidewalk. Music drifted from open windows. A group of elderly men sat on plastic chairs outside a corner store, laughing at something one of them had said. Clara walked 3 blocks, then turned into a building with a faded blue door. She climbed the steps slowly, her bag heavy on her shoulder, and disappeared inside. Arthur stood across the street, watching the windows on the 3rd floor until a light came on in one of them. He imagined her inside, making tea, sitting on her couch, pulling out her knitting. He imagined the needles clicking in the quiet of her small apartment, the scarf growing beneath her fingers, the only sound in a room that held no one else. He stayed there for a long time, leaning against a lamppost, watching the light in her window. He did not know what he was looking for. He did not know what he hoped to find. But something had shifted inside him, something he had thought was long dead, something his grandmother had planted in him years ago and he had let wither in the soil of his ambition. He wanted to help her. But he knew, with the certainty of a man who had learned many hard lessons, that help could not be given without being asked for. It could not be forced onto someone who had not requested it. Real help, the kind that lasted, the kind that mattered, had to come from a place of respect. It had to honor the dignity of the person receiving it. He walked back to the subway station, his hands in his pockets, his mind turning over possibilities. He thought about the scarf in his apartment, the blue one he had bought from her, the one he held in his hands each night before sleep. He thought about the way her fingers moved, the way she smiled at her customers, the way she carried herself despite everything. And he thought about his grandmother's needles, the ones she had left him when she died, the ones he had kept in a drawer for 40 years, too afraid to touch them, too afraid of what they might remind him. When he reached his apartment that night, he opened the drawer in his bedroom. At the bottom, wrapped in a cloth that had yellowed with age, were 2 wooden knitting needles. They were worn smooth from years of use, their tips slightly curved, their surface polished by the hands that had held them. He picked them up, feeling their weight, their warmth, the history they carried. He sat on the edge of his bed, the needles in his hands, and for the first time in 40 years, he let himself cry. Clara found the note on Monday morning, tucked into the pocket of her uniform. She had arrived at work at 6 o'clock as always, changed in the basement locker room, and reached for her cleaning supplies when her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. Paper. Folded into a small square, pressed into the pocket where she kept her bus pass and her emergency $20 bill. She pulled it out with trembling hands. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal correspondence, with a faint texture that spoke of quality. The handwriting was firm, elegant, the letters formed with the kind of care that came from practice. It read, Your scarves are beautiful. You are seen. You matter. There was no signature. No name. No indication of who had left it or how it had gotten into her pocket. Clara read the words 3 times, then a 4th, then a 5th. Her hands shook. Her eyes burned. She pressed the paper to her chest as if it might disappear if she let it go, and she stood in the locker room for a long moment, breathing, waiting for her heart to slow. Who could have written this? Who knew about her scarves? She had told no one at work. She had been careful, so careful, to keep her 2 lives separate. The cleaner who mopped floors and emptied trash cans. The woman who knitted scarves in the subway and sold them to strangers. They were not supposed to meet. They were not supposed to know each other. But someone knew. Someone had seen her. Someone had watched her in the subway station, or on the platform, or walking home through the dark streets of her neighborhood. Someone had noticed her. And instead of looking away, they had left her this message, these words that felt like a hand reaching out in the darkness. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket, next to her heart. Then she picked up her cleaning cart and went to work. The day passed in a blur. She moved through the corridors, spraying and wiping, emptying bins and sweeping floors, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the note. She thought about the handwriting. She thought about the way the words had been chosen, so simple and so powerful, as if the writer had known exactly what she needed to hear. During her lunch break, she sat in her usual spot near the service elevator, her lunchbox unopened beside her. She took out the note instead, unfolded it, and read it again. The words had not changed. They were still there, written in ink on paper, solid and real. Someone had taken the time to write this. Someone had taken the risk to leave it for her. She looked around the corridor, at the empty hallways and closed doors. Who here could have written this? The security guards who watched the cameras? The janitor who worked the night shift? The executives who passed her without a glance? She thought of the man who had bought the blue scarf last week. He had been different from her usual customers. There was something about the way he had looked at her, the way he had held the scarf in his hands, the way he had said thank you like he meant something more than the words. He had worn old clothes and a cap pulled low, but there was something in his bearing, something in the way he stood, that suggested he was not accustomed to hiding. She shook her head. She was imagining things. She was inventing stories to explain a mystery that probably had a simple answer. One of her customers had recognized her, that was all. Someone from the subway had seen her at work and left a kind note. It happened. People were good sometimes. People did unexpected things. But even as she told herself this, she knew it was not true. There was something about the note, something about the paper, something about the handwriting, that felt intentional. Deliberate. Personal. She tucked the note away and forced herself to eat her lunch. The rice was cold, the chicken dry, but she chewed and swallowed because her body needed fuel, because she could not afford to waste food, because life continued whether she understood it or not. That evening, she walked to the subway station with a new awareness. She looked at the faces around her, searching for someone who might be watching. A man in a suit reading a newspaper. A woman with a stroller, her toddler asleep inside. A group of teenagers laughing at something on a phone. None of them looked at her. None of them seemed to notice her at all. She set up her table in the usual spot and laid out her scarves. Business was slow. A woman bought a gray scarf for her husband. A man bought a red one for his daughter. Clara accepted the money, made change, smiled, and kept her eyes on the crowd. And then she saw him. He was standing at the other end of the platform, leaning against a pillar, his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket. He was tall, with gray hair that caught the light, and there was something familiar about the way he stood, the way his shoulders were set, the way his eyes seemed to be fixed on her. She knew him. He was the man from last week, the one who had bought the blue scarf. The one who had looked at her like she was the only person in the world. He was wearing the same old clothes, the same cap pulled low, but tonight there was no mistaking him. He was watching her. He had been watching her for some time, she realized, and the thought sent a chill down her spine that was not from cold. He did not approach her. He did not buy a scarf. He simply stood there, watching, and Clara did not know whether to be frightened or curious or something else entirely. She packed up her scarves earlier than usual, her hands shaking as she folded her cloth and zipped her bag. She walked toward the train without looking back, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. On the train, she sat with her back to the doors, her bag clutched against her chest. She did not see him bored. She did not see him follow her. But she felt watched, the way a deer feels watched from the trees, a primal awareness that someone was there. When she reached her stop, she hurried up the stairs and onto the street. She walked quickly, her steps echoing on the empty sidewalk, her breath coming in short gasps. She did not look back. She did not slow down. She reached her building, unlocked the blue door, and climbed the 3 flights of stairs without stopping. Inside her apartment, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving, her hands pressed flat against the wood. She waited. She listened. There were footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured, climbing toward her floor. They stopped outside her door. She held her breath. A piece of paper slid under the door. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then she knelt down, her fingers trembling, and picked it up. The same thick paper. The same elegant handwriting. "I did not mean to frighten you. I only wanted to see your work. You have a gift, Clara. Do not hide it." She turned the paper over, hoping for more, but there was nothing else. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered into the hallway. It was empty. The stairs were silent. Whoever had left the note was gone. She closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the floor with her back against the wood. She unfolded both notes and laid them side by side on the floor. "Your scarves are beautiful. You are seen. You matter. You have a gift, Clara. Do not hide it." How did he know her name? She thought of the man on the platform, his gray hair, his steady gaze, the way he had looked at her like she was not invisible. She thought of the blue scarf he had bought, the way he had held it, the way he had thanked her. She thought of the footsteps on the stairs, the paper sliding under her door, the silence that followed. She should be afraid. A stranger had followed her home. A stranger knew her name. A stranger had left messages in her uniform pocket and under her door. Everything in her said she should be frightened, should call someone, should report this to the police. But she was not frightened. She was something else. Something she could not name. Something that felt like hope, like possibility, like the first light of dawn after a very long night. She read the notes again, and again, until the words became part of her. You are seen. You matter. You have a gift. Do not hide it. For the first time in 8 years, Clara Mendez allowed herself to believe that someone saw her. And for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she stopped hiding. The next morning, Clara arrived at work earlier than usual. She had not slept well. The notes were folded in her pocket, pressed against her heart, and she had spent the night turning the words over in her mind like stones worn smooth by a river. You are seen. You have a gift. She did not know who had written them. She did not know what they wanted. But something had shifted inside her, a door opening that she had locked long ago, and she could not close it again. She changed into her uniform in the basement locker room, her movements automatic, her thoughts elsewhere. When she reached for her cleaning cart, she found another note tucked into the handle. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The same paper. The same handwriting. Meet me in the 31st floor conference room at noon. Come alone. I have something to show you. Clara read the words 3 times. The 31st floor. That was where the executives worked. That was where Arthur Davenport, the owner of the company, had his office. She had never been above the 25th floor. She was not allowed. Her uniform, her cart, her presence belonged to the lower floors, the service elevators, the spaces that no one else wanted. But the note said to come. The note said she had a gift. The note said she was seen. She tucked the paper into her pocket with the others and began her work. The morning passed in a haze of cleaning and wiping, of emptying bins and sweeping floors. She could not focus. Her mind kept drifting to the 31st floor, to the conference room she had only heard about in whispers, to the man who had followed her home and left notes under her door. At 11:30, she went to the locker room. She washed her face, smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her uniform was clean, her shoes were polished, her hands were scrubbed free of the chemicals she used for cleaning. She looked like what she was. A cleaner. A woman who mopped floors and emptied trash. But there was something different in her eyes today. Something that had not been there before. A light. A spark. A question that was waiting to be answered. She took the service elevator to the 25th floor, the highest it would go. From there, she had to walk. She climbed the stairs to the 26th floor, then the 27th, then the 28th. Each flight was quieter than the last, the carpet thicker, the walls more polished, the air somehow cleaner. By the time she reached the 29th floor, she felt like she was walking through a different world. The 30th floor opened into a lobby of marble and glass. A reception desk stood at the center, empty now, the receptionist presumably at lunch. Clara walked past it, her footsteps silent on the polished floor, and found the stairs to the 31st floor. She climbed the final flight slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The door at the top was heavy, made of dark wood with a brass handle. She pushed it open and stepped into a corridor that was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were lined with paintings, real paintings, the kind that hung in museums. The floor was covered in a carpet so thick her shoes made no sound. The lights were soft, warm, designed to make the space feel like something other than an office. The conference room was at the end of the corridor, its door open. Clara walked toward it, her legs feeling weak, her breath shallow. She stopped at the threshold and looked inside. The room was enormous. A table of polished wood ran down the center, long enough to seat 30 people. Chairs upholstered in leather surrounded it, their arms gleaming with brass accents. The far wall was made of glass, looking out over the city, the buildings spread out below like toys in a child's playroom. And standing at the window, his back to her, was a man. He turned when she entered, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. She had seen him in the subway, buying her scarves. She had seen him on the platform, watching her from a distance. She had seen his handwriting on the notes in her pocket. But she had not known who he was. Not until this moment. He was Arthur Davenport. The owner of the company. The man who employed her. The millionaire who had built an empire from nothing and now stood before her in a perfectly tailored suit, his gray hair combed back, his hands clasped behind his back. Clara wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go back to the basement, to her cleaning cart, to the life where she was invisible and safe. But her feet would not move. Her voice would not work. She stood in the doorway, frozen, while Arthur Davenport looked at her with eyes that were not cold or dismissive or cruel. He looked at her like she mattered. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was calm, warm, the same voice she had heard when he bought the blue scarf. "Please, sit down." He gestured to a chair near the end of the table. Clara walked toward it on legs that did not feel like her own and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the man who had followed her home. He sat across from her, not at the head of the table, not in the position of power, but facing her directly, eye to eye. He placed his hands on the table, palms down, and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "And I owe you an apology. I followed you. I watched you. I left notes in your locker and under your door. I invaded your privacy, and I am sorry. That was not my right." Clara said nothing. She did not know what to say. Her mind was still trying to catch up, to make sense of what was happening. "I saw you in the subway," Arthur continued. "I saw your scarves. I watched your hands move, the way you knit, the care you put into every stitch. And I was reminded of someone I lost a long time ago. My grandmother. She knitted too. She made things for everyone, gave them away, asked for nothing in return. I was too young to understand what she was giving. I was too young to appreciate the gift she offered." He paused, and Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain. Regret. The kind of loss that never fully healed. "I watched you for weeks," he said. "I watched you work. I watched you clean floors and empty trash and scrub bathrooms. I watched you eat your lunch alone, knitting in the corner, never complaining, never asking for anything. And I watched you in the subway, selling the things you made, giving pieces of yourself to strangers who did not know your name." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "I have spent 40 years building something that I thought would matter. Money. Power. A name that people recognize. But when I watched you, Clara, I realized that I have been building the wrong things. You create warmth. You create beauty. You take nothing and turn it into something that keeps people from being cold. That is a gift. A real gift. The kind that cannot be bought." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, her throat tight, her chest aching. "I want to show you something," Arthur said. He stood and walked to a cabinet on the far wall. He opened it and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age, its edges rounded by years of handling. He brought it back to the table and set it in front of her. "Open it," he said. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 wooden knitting needles. They were old, older than anything she owned, their surfaces polished to a soft gleam, their tips slightly curved from years of use. She lifted one out, feeling its weight, its warmth, the history it carried. "They were my grandmother's," Arthur said. "She brought them from Portugal when she came to this country. She knitted with them every day for 60 years. When she died, I put them in a drawer and I did not touch them for 40 years. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what they would remind me. Afraid of the love I had wasted when I had the chance to receive it." He reached out and closed his hand over Clara's, the needles between their palms. "I took them out last week," he said. "After I saw you. After I bought the blue scarf. I held them for the first time in 40 years, and I understood something I had been too proud to see. The things we make with our hands, the things we give to others, the things we create from nothing. That is what matters. That is what lasts." He let go of her hand and sat back in his chair. "I am not offering you charity," he said. "I am not offering you pity. What I am offering you is something different. I want to help you sell your scarves. Not as a handout. As a partnership. I have resources, contacts, a platform. You have talent, skill, something real that people need. Together, we could build something. Something that matters." Clara stared at him, the needles still in her hands, her mind spinning. She thought of her mother, teaching her to knit, telling her that this was how they survived. She thought of the years she had spent hiding, invisible, alone. She thought of the notes in her pocket, the words that had woken something in her that she thought was dead. "I do not understand," she whispered. "Why me? Why do you care?" Arthur smiled, and for a moment he looked younger, lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Because you remind me that I am not invisible either," he said. "Because you remind me that there is still time to make things right. Because I looked at your hands, Clara, and I saw something I had forgotten. The power to create warmth. The power to matter. And I want to help you share that with the world." Clara looked down at the needles in her hands. They were beautiful. They were old. They were waiting, like her, to be used again. The rumors started within a week. Clara noticed them first in the way people looked at her. The secretaries who had always ignored her now stared when she passed. The junior executives who had never said her name now whispered behind their hands. The security guards who had nodded at her each morning now watched her with something that looked like suspicion. She was called to the 31st floor twice more that week. Each time, she took the stairs, climbed past the floors where she had cleaned for years, and walked into a world that was not her own. Arthur showed her plans, ideas, sketches for a small business that would sell her scarves to a wider audience. He talked about websites and marketing and branding, words that felt foreign on her tongue but filled her with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. But the rumors grew faster than the plans. Someone had seen her leaving the 31st floor. Someone had seen Arthur's assistant bringing her coffee in the conference room. Someone had seen her sitting in a chair that was meant for people with titles and salaries and names that mattered. By the second week, the whispers had become words. People said she was sleeping with him. They said she was blackmailing him. They said she had tricked him somehow, a cleaner who had wormed her way into the owner's office using methods no one wanted to name. Clara heard them. She heard them in the break room when she went to heat her lunch. She heard them in the corridors when she pushed her cart past groups that fell silent at her approach. She heard them in the locker room, where women who had never spoken to her now spoke about her in voices loud enough to carry. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She had learned long ago that explanations were wasted on people who had already decided what they believed. She simply lowered her head and kept working, kept cleaning, kept moving through the world like a whisper. But it hurt. It hurt more than she expected. She had been invisible for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen in the wrong way. To have her intentions questioned, her character doubted, her dignity stripped away by people who did not know her and did not want to. Arthur noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. He found her on the 23rd floor one afternoon, alone in a conference room she was cleaning after a meeting. She was standing by the window, a spray bottle in one hand, a cloth in the other, staring out at the city without seeing it. Her shoulders were slumped in a way he had not seen since those first weeks, when she had been nothing but a cleaner pushing a cart through corridors that did not want her. "Clara," he said, and she turned, startled, her hand going to her chest. He closed the door behind him. They were alone in the room, the city spread out below them, the light falling across her face in a way that made her look younger, softer, more fragile than he had ever seen her. "I know what they are saying," he said. "I know it is difficult. I want you to know that I will handle it. I will speak to HR. I will make sure people understand that our meetings are professional, that nothing improper is happening." Clara shook her head. "Do not," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "If you speak for me, they will only believe it more. They will say you are protecting me because there is something to protect. Let them talk. They will find something else to talk about soon enough." Arthur studied her for a long moment. She was stronger than he had given her credit for. Stronger than most people he knew, including himself. "This is not fair to you," he said. "You did nothing wrong. You should not have to endure this." Clara set down the spray bottle and cloth. She wiped her hands on her uniform, a gesture he had seen her make 100 times, and looked him in the eye. I have endured worse, she said. I have been invisible for 8 years. I have cleaned floors while people stepped over me. I have sold scarves in the subway while people pretended I was not there. At least now they see me. Even if it is not the way I want, at least they see me. Arthur felt something crack open in his chest. He had known loss. He had known loneliness. He had known what it was to work until his body screamed and still have nothing to show for it. But he had never known what it was to be invisible. To be so unimportant that people looked through you instead of at you. To be so small that your presence did not register in the minds of the people around you. I am sorry, he said, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in years. Clara smiled, a small smile, a tired smile, but a real one. Do not be sorry. Just do not give up on the plan. I have been hiding for too long. It is time to be seen. She picked up her cleaning supplies and walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at him. Your grandmother's needles, she said. You gave them to me. You said you wanted me to use them. I have been carrying them with me every day. They help. Knowing that someone else's hands held them, someone else's love went into them. It helps. She left before he could respond, and Arthur stood alone in the conference room, looking at the door she had closed behind her. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the scarves she had made, the blankets, the hats, the things she had given away without asking for anything in return. He thought about how he had wasted her gifts, how he had been too young and too stupid to understand what she was offering. He would not waste Clara's gifts. He would not let her disappear again. That night, he made phone calls. He talked to lawyers and accountants and marketing directors. He used his name, his reputation, his money. But this time, he used them for something that mattered. Something that would last. Something that his grandmother would have understood. Clara walked home through the dark streets of her neighborhood, her bag heavy with scarves, her pocket thick with notes. She thought about Arthur's words, about his grandmother's needles, about the plans they were making. She thought about the rumors and the whispers and the way people looked at her now. And she thought about her mother, who had taught her to knit, who had told her that this was how they survived. We make things, her mother had said. We create warmth when the world gives us cold. Clara climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, unlocked the 2 locks, and stepped into the small yellow room that was hers. She sat on her couch, pulled out the wooden needles Arthur had given her, and began to knit. The needles moved in her hands, older than her mother, older than Arthur, older than anything she owned. They had been held by hands that had loved and lost and loved again. They had created warmth for 60 years. She would make them create warmth for 60 more. The day of the launch arrived faster than Clara expected. Arthur had arranged everything. A small boutique in a neighborhood that appreciated handmade things. A website that showed her scarves against backgrounds of soft light and quiet streets. A photographer who had come to her apartment and captured her hands at work, the needles moving, the yarn winding, the scarves growing row by row. But the most important thing, the thing that changed everything, happened 3 days before the launch. Arthur called her to the 31st floor in the afternoon, not for a meeting about business but for something else. When she arrived, he was not sitting at the conference table. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He turned when she entered, and Clara saw that his eyes were red, his face drawn, as if he had not slept. Close the door, he said, and she did. He gestured to a chair, and she sat. He remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the window, his hands moving as he spoke. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I have not told anyone. Something I should have told you from the beginning. Clara waited. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back straight, her heart beating a steady rhythm in her chest. When I followed you, Arthur said, it was not only because you reminded me of my grandmother. That was part of it. But there was something else. something I did not understand until last night. He stopped pacing and faced her. His hands were shaking, she noticed. Arthur Davenport, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had negotiated deals worth millions, the man who had never shown weakness in front of anyone, was shaking. My grandmother, he said, did not only knit for strangers. She knitted for someone she lost. A daughter. A little girl who died when she was 7 years old. My mother. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. I never knew her, Arthur continued. She died before I was born. My grandmother raised me alone, and she never talked about my mother. Not once. The only way she knew how to grieve was to knit. She knitted for the daughter she lost, for the grandchildren she hoped to have, for the family that was taken from her. And when she died, I found the scarves she had made for me. Dozens of them. All the years I was growing up, she was making things for me, and I never knew. He walked to the cabinet where he had kept his grandmother's needles and pulled out a box that Clara had not seen before. It was larger than the first, made of dark wood, its lid carved with flowers that had been worn smooth by time. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were scarves. Not the ones she made, not the ones she had seen in stores or markets. These were different. Older. The yarn was faded, the colors muted by age, the stitches slightly uneven in the way that handmade things always were. But they were beautiful. Each one was a work of patience and love, of hours spent with needles and yarn, of grief transformed into something warm. Arthur lifted one out, a scarf the color of old roses, and held it in his hands. She made these for me, he said. Every year, for 40 years, she made me a scarf. I never wore them. I never knew they existed until after she was gone. And last night, I took them out of this box for the first time since she died. I held them. I felt the wool. I felt her hands in every stitch. And I understood why I followed you. Why I could not stop watching you. Why I had to help you. He set the scarf down and looked at Clara with eyes that held 40 years of grief. You look like her, he said. My mother. I found a photograph of her last night, the only one that exists. She was sitting in a chair, knitting, her head bent over her work. And you look exactly like her. The same face. The same hands. The same light in your eyes when you are creating something. Clara could not speak. Her throat was closed, her chest tight, her hands pressed together in her lap. I am not saying this to burden you, Arthur said. I am saying it because I need you to know why I am doing this. It is not charity. It is not pity. It is not even kindness. It is something I owe. To her. To my grandmother. To the little girl who died too young and the woman who spent her life grieving her. I saw you, Clara, and I saw them. I saw what I lost. And I saw a chance to make it right. He sat down across from her, the old rose scarf still in his hands. I want you to have these, he said. These scarves my grandmother made. I want you to use them. Display them. Let people see what patience and love can create. Let them be part of your story. Because they are part of mine, and I have kept them hidden for too long. Clara reached out and touched the scarf. The wool was soft beneath her fingers, worn by time, softened by years of waiting. She could feel the stitches, each one a moment of someone's life, each one a prayer, a hope, a memory made tangible. She thought of her mother, teaching her to knit. She thought of the scarves she had made, the ones she sold in the subway, the ones that kept strangers warm. She thought of Arthur's grandmother, knitting in her chair by the window, her needles moving, her grief transforming into something that would outlast her. And she understood. Not with her mind, not with words, but with something deeper. Something that connected her to Arthur, to his grandmother, to her mother, to all the women who had sat with needles in their hands and turned nothing into something, turned loss into warmth, turned grief into beauty. "I will take them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will honor them. I will let people see what she made. What you both made." Arthur's hands stopped shaking. He folded the old rose scarf and placed it back in the box, careful, reverent, as if it were made of something more fragile than wool. "Thank you," he said, and Clara heard in his voice the same words he had spoken when he bought the blue scarf in the subway. Words that meant more than they said. Words that carried the weight of a life spent searching for something he had lost and had finally found. They sat together in the conference room as the sun set over the city, the box of scarves between them, the needles in Clara's bag, and a silence that was not empty but full. Full of memories, full of grief, full of hope. Full of the things that could not be bought or sold, the things that lasted, the things that mattered. The boutique opened on a Saturday morning in early spring. Clara stood outside the door at 7 o'clock, her hands clasped in front of her, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The street was quiet at this hour, the shops still closed, the cafes not yet serving coffee. She had arrived early because she could not sleep, because she needed to see it with her own eyes, because she still did not quite believe it was real. The sign above the door read Clara's hands in letters of soft gold. The window display showed her scarves arranged on wooden forms, the colors arranged in a spectrum from deep burgundy to pale cream. In the center of the display, on a small pedestal, lay the old rose scarf that Arthur's grandmother had made. A card beside it read, "Made with love, waiting to be found." Clara pressed her palm against the glass and felt the warmth of her own hand reflected back. This was hers. This small space, these walls, these scarves hanging in neat rows. She had made this. With Arthur's help, yes, with his money and his connections and his belief in her. But she had made it too. Her hands had created the things that filled this room. Her patience, her hours, her love. The door behind her opened, and she turned. Arthur stood in the doorway, dressed not in a suit but in a simple sweater and jeans. He looked different without the armor of his success. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for too long. "You are early," he said. "I could not wait," she said. He smiled, and she saw in his face the boy he had been, the boy who had slept on park benches and washed dishes in restaurant kitchens, the boy who had lost his mother before he was born and his grandmother before he understood what she had given him. "Neither could I," he said. He stepped aside, and Clara walked into her shop for the first time as the owner. The walls were painted yellow, the same yellow as her apartment, the same yellow her mother had always said brought happiness. The shelves were lined with her scarves, each one labeled with the date it was finished, the yarn it was made from, the story behind its colors. In the back corner, a small table held a chair and a basket of yarn, a place where she could sit and knit when the shop was quiet. Arthur stood in the center of the room, looking at the scarves, at the walls, at the small space that had become something more than a shop. It was a home for everything she had made. A place where her work would be seen, valued, held in hands that would carry it into the world. "You did this," he said, and his voice was thick with something she had not heard before. "We did this," she said. "I could not have done it without you." He shook his head. "I gave you money. I gave you space. But you gave yourself. Every scarf in this room, every stitch, every hour you spent with needles in your hands. That is what matters. That is what will last." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the street. The sun was rising now, the light turning the glass of the buildings across the way to gold. People were beginning to appear, walking to work, opening shops, starting their days. Soon they would come through her door. They would touch her scarves, ask her questions, carry pieces of her work into their lives. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to knit, who had told her that this was how they survived. She thought of Arthur's grandmother, knitting in her chair by the window, turning grief into something warm. She thought of all the women who had sat with needles in their hands, creating beauty from nothing, giving warmth to a world that offered so little. She was one of them now. Not invisible. Not hiding. Seen. The door opened at 9 o'clock, and the first customer came in. A young woman with a baby on her hip, looking for a gift for her mother. Clara showed her the scarves, explained the colors, told her about the yarn. The woman chose a scarf the color of deep water, the same blue that Arthur had bought that first night in the subway. She paid with a smile, and Clara wrapped the scarf in tissue paper, placed it in a bag, and handed it over. "Thank you," the woman said. "It is beautiful." Clara watched her leave, the scarf in her bag, the baby on her hip, and felt something she had not felt in 8 years. Joy. Pure, simple, undeniable joy. Arthur was standing by the window, watching her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His face said everything. Pride. Gratitude. Something else, something that had been growing between them in the weeks since he had called her to the 31st floor, something that neither of them had named but both of them felt. "Will you stay?" she asked him. "For a while?" He smiled, and for a moment he was not the millionaire, not the owner of an empire, not the man who had built something from nothing. He was just a man, standing in a small shop, looking at a woman who had taught him something he had forgotten. "I will stay," he said. "For as long as you want me to." Clara turned back to the window, to the street, to the morning light that was filling her shop with warmth. She thought about the notes he had left her, the words that had woken something in her she thought was dead. "You are seen. You matter. You have a gift." She had a gift. She had always had it. But it had taken someone else's eyes to show her what she had been carrying all along. She picked up the wooden needles from the table, his grandmother's needles, the ones that had held so much love and loss and hope. She sat in the chair by the window, the yarn in her lap, and began to knit. The needles clicked in the quiet room, their rhythm familiar, their song the same song her mother had taught her, the same song Arthur's grandmother had sung with her hands. Arthur pulled a chair beside her and sat down. He did not speak. He did not need to. He watched her hands move, the needles flashing in the morning light, the scarf growing beneath her fingers row by row, stitch by stitch. He watched her create something from nothing, transform yarn into warmth, make something that would outlast them both. And in the small shop on the quiet street, with the sun rising over the city and the first customers beginning to arrive, Clara Mendez and Arthur Davenport sat together, two people who had been invisible in different ways, who had found each other in the most unexpected place, who had learned that the things we make with our hands are the things that last. The needles clicked. The yarn wound itself around her fingers. And Clara smiled, because for the first time in her life, she was exactly where